So our next presenter is Sally Applin with the University of Kent. Canterbury. Canterbury, that's right. And she's involved in a lot of different things. Familiar a little bit with the Internet of Things, but so she'll be sharing with us her presentation. So, feel free.
So I work with Dr. Michael Fisher in the Center for Social Anthropology and Computing at Kent, but I live here and do fieldwork here. So the title of my talk is Heads Up, Designing for Polysocial Reality in Age of Media, but I've kind of added in all of those. This isn't really a talk about where to put interface elements within Age of Media. It's talking about the context within which they're situated. So what I'm going to talk about is the current landscape of technology, where we are today, what the big design problem is that I see, which is accessibility, what is it, why do we need it, and where we left off in 2011. I gave a talk here a couple of years ago, sort of how we measure out based on what we said before, what's social now, and what I like to call moving towards the magic bus. So this is the current landscape, and this is not an unfamiliar theme. It's a little exaggerated, I think, because everyone's on a device and they're all looking down. And if we insert head-mounted displays into this, it's not going to be a complete adaptation overnight. People aren't going to adopt that easily. They're not going to all of a sudden be looking through things. It's going to happen in pieces, what we call adaptive radiation. So within the street scene, if you can imagine, everyone's looking down, but some people are going to be looking up. Wires like the bicycle might have haptic, and the environment might have sensors, and there's going to be some other things added to this environment. And while everyone looks like they're doing quite an individual sort of thing with their devices, they're actually being very social. We just aren't in the local locale able to understand who they're connecting to and what they're doing. And that's the space that I study and what we're interested in. So we don't have a siloed environment. What we have is a connected environment. All these ladies are probably not hardcore gamers. This is a bit of an old slide. But it does show that as people are interacting, they're interacting through these services and as different accounts, different logins, different aspects of their interest in their minds that come through these devices. And as they're connecting, they're sending multiple messages. So what we're looking at in polysocial reality is this entire landscape, this conceptual model of all the little messages that we send. So when Gene in his talk showed all the things that people can do that connect to their Fitbit, that can send all these messages, each thing, every text I send, every time I'm talking to someone, talking in synchronous time now to all of you, but you might be tweeting to someone else about whether or not you like the last talk or like this talk. That's a multiplexed messaging. So each time we communicate, we're sending these little tiny pieces together out into the network. And we're looking at the construction of all of these messages and what the aggregate of those mean. So it's people to people, people to machine, and machine to machine. There's an awful lot of messages we need to manage. Now we're going to add headsets to that. And we're going to add the Internet of Things to that. So the amount of messages that we have is just going to be multiplied. On a small scale, polysocial reality looks kind of like this. It's sort of a small, messy diagram. But if you can imagine all these lines coming from each connection that you make, and everyone else's too, you can start to understand how big this problem is and how interesting it is. So we say with Poser is that it describes the aggregate of these multiplexed, multiple, synchronous or asynchronous individual data creations, all these little messages. And there's an outcome from doing this model. We're seeing that people are expanding their networks and their connections, which is great, right? It increases the amount of people we can talk to and maintain ties with. But it also creates fragmentation in our local locale, and it creates individuated experiences. We don't always understand what someone else is doing when they're connecting. But the most important thing, this is probably the most important point I'm going to make, is that asynchronicity has become an adaptive strategy. People are using the ability to send asynchronous messages as a way to manage their time, and everybody's doing it in an individual way. So they may wait to send work messages till 2 in the morning because they know nobody's going to respond and they won't have to do even more messages. So each person that's using these devices is starting to shift towards a more asynchronous model in the way they behave. So people in a certain age group have stopped wanting to use phone calls, direct phone calls. They'd rather send messages. That's a sample of that asynchronous shift. So when we think about polysocial reality or Poser, it's the aggregate of all the messages that are coming through all of these phones and devices. Now this photo is a pretty old photo in that everybody kind of has the same device. We're starting to see a more complex interaction environment which is this has an iPad and some other devices, but now there's going to be headsets and there's going to be some other things happening. How are we going to deal with designing for this complex interactive environment, both on a technical level to manage all that message passing and from a user experience point of view? So heterogeneous means dissimilar and mixed, composed of these diverse elements. And with HMDs, not everybody's going to have them, or they're not going to have the same kind. So that's another part of this heterogeneity that we're describing. And within the content, people have different apps, locations, they're using different networks, they're in different places, they have different structures depending on where they are in the world. I mean, there's like 700,000 apps in the iTunes store for Macs, or for iPhones. It's like, that's a lot, if you think about it. So what combination of 700,000 do people with iPhones actually have that are similar? Is everyone's phone configured the same or differently? If you walk away from any other point besides asynchronous time as an adaptation, think about designing for heterogeneity and designing for sociability. We talk about heterogeneity as the way that humans interpret signals and interact with each other, and that this happens in both analog and digital communications. We wrote a paper about this in Visualizing Polysocial Reality, and that's the URL, I have it. And why we care so much about heterogeneity is that humans depend on each other. It's not like, oh yeah, I have my iPhone, I don't need you anymore. I have my headset, whatever, I'm here. Everything that we need to live is a result of an incredible amount of complex communication within chains of systems of people and effective messages that are received by them to be able to make the world that we live in. We can't be independent very easily anymore. We're so tied up in fuel and food and other resources. And the way that those things get made are through this massive coordinated effort among all these people that use messaging to communicate, to successfully produce things that we need in the world to live. And that kind of cooperation requires shared information. If everybody's modeling their time asynchronously, right, we're all sort of switching and we're managing our own time, the messages that we receive and send need to be understood. If there's enough overlap, we can cooperate. If there isn't enough overlap, what happens? We send more messages till someone understands, or the messages are missed. If messages are missed, we have problems. They just didn't get the message that the bridge was closed, right? There's bigger problems when messages are missed. So if we have an increased amount of messages, if we have a propensity for asynchronicity, and we need cooperation, we have to put those things together to think about what we can do in our environment. So we say, well, the tools should know human needs. We should know how to make tools that can anticipate things, and that's what we're working on, and that's what's so interesting about it. Where we left off in 2011 with the talk I gave was how to make AR more social. And one of the problems at the time that we observed was that AR wasn't very social. Like, people could have these experiences and you could each have the same experience separately, but it wasn't the same experience necessarily, and it was different if some people had devices and you didn't, and so forth. But we did find that games that had multiple player components, that one person or a few were using the AR on the phone, but then it was like an alternate reality game people could play in space. People enjoyed that and could cooperate and collaborate. Projection that allowed people to gather around some projected image that they may or may not have needed the projector to own it, but they could still participate in the game. And that sensors, which created this active, intelligent environment in the background to kind of offload some of the tasks of having to be tethered, could also shift some of the burden of information on the devices. We talked about the London bus system that has a sensor that projects information about the time coming in on an overhead sign, so people are no longer forced to look at their phones. We talked about how people have the same sensors but different shared experiences. This is another thing to really remember from this talk. That we're basically built alike, and some of us have lost certain sensory capabilities, and some of them are tuned differently, but we have the basic same sensors, but we all have different experiences from using those. And the environment can be a tool. It can be used as a tool to understand and respond to us. In this case, this is an AR example that they have, the couple has absolutely no devices on them, but they're interacting with something in the environment in an augmented reality way, which is interesting. One of the things I really like that's coming up is Cast AR from Technical Illusions. Jerry Ellsworth and Rick Johnson were very nice to share some photos. Cast AR is interesting in that there's a hardware and graphical component, and they have this special backdrop that people can gather around. And what they can do is make an AR experience more social. And the way that they can do that is that the shared experience is onto the projection, but while people are looking at the projection, they can also look in the real world and interact with objects. Another example that we really like is the Magic Bus. I don't know if is anybody familiar with the Magic Bus? Yeah, the Magic Bus. So the Magic Bus is a great example of shared human experience. So what we are trying to do, because we have high heterogeneity and because we have asynchronous messaging and because we're all kind of doing different things on different channels, we are losing common experience. And if we don't have common experience, it's very hard for us to socialize, to know each other, and cooperate. The Magic Bus is a very interesting example of like analog backwards AR, but I really like it. It's a school bus that's retrofitted for people to take a tour of San Francisco, 1960 San Francisco. They go onto the bus, the shades come down, it projects both historical information or music and sound, some kind of experience for them, while the bus is taking them to the environment. When they get to the environment, the shades go up, and they're in this place, having had their perception sort of altered while they're on the way. We like to think of the Magic Bus as AR in advance. And one of the things we like about the Magic Bus a lot is that people are social in that they're having a shared experience. They are able to, it's shifting time a little bit, so people are having AR on the way to the location rather than having it delivered at the location, which is an interesting idea. And it creates a sense of a shared experience that can endure as people have the experience over and over again in different ways and talk to each other about it. This slide is really of Burning Man, and Burning Man's not AR, but what I like about this slide is this is creativity, it is cooperation, it is play and ingenuity, and all the things that humans are great at. And how can AR be made to share this experience for people? How can AR provide this kind of distributed, in a distributed way, give people a shared experience that they experience in their own time, because everybody's doing things in their own time. But still, if they have a shared experience across that time, they have a shared experience that they can communicate with and talk about. So, in summary, think about designing for heterogeneity and cooperation, and provide hooks in whatever you're making in AR, head-mounted, face-staring, sensing, whatever it's going to be, that have hooks in it that people can have these shared experiences. What's that going to be like? Play with time. Does AR have to be right now, or can you augment what people are about to experience or what they've already experienced? How can time be stretched and manipulated in AR? The goal is to connect people through shared experiences, because this produces that shared cooperation and better understanding, which we need, which supports society. And that's that's kind of the reason why people talk about sports, because they have it's this common sort of universal that everyone knows, or not everyone, but people that follow it, all of a sudden, no matter what city they're in whatever country or whatever kind of sport, they have a common thing to bond with and talk about. And we're losing that rapidly as we individuate so much with the way that we manage our experiences. So how can AR kind of bring back social connection? Thank you for your time. This is how you find us and our papers.